Hello, we are at Sphere, and welcome to Cyber Threats Exposed. As ever, I'm Tim. I'm joined by my colleague Steve.
Hi.
And we've got a special guest with us, Dan Raywood, a media. Because we are at Sphere, our conference, we've got the opportunity to extend the realms of our echo chamber, and we've managed to collar one of our media representatives, Dan Raywood. So at Dan Raywood, if you're interested, say hello.
Hello. Good to be here.
Thanks. We were really looking for a wider perspective on some of the things that we're going to talk about, which is kind of all of the cyber threats that we're looking to expose from May 2024.
This podcast is brought to you by Flow, the smart choice for business transformation through technology and cyber solutions. Founded in 2008, Flow focuses on providing efficient solutions to organizations, enabling them to do business in confidence without fear of cyber attacks.
Yeah, great. So, how do we feel? Are you ready to go, Steve?
Yep.
So, welcome, Dan.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. We would have thought that Northern Europe would be hotter than Britain this week, but yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, great. What are the top stories from May, Steve?
First thing is ransomware and espionage statistics. It's the month for it seems. People are publishing them, and I've been reading them. So BitSight, they do like internet scanning for vulnerabilities, and they've published with a couple of qualifiers some information about people not even patching, but remediating. So I guess that involves turning things off as well. And they've said that vulnerabilities that are in CISA's KEV, so the known exploited vulnerability catalog, have a median remediation time of just about 6 months, 180 days. And if they are not in the KEV, then it is more likely to be 621 days until they're patched, which is a lot. And they also said 35% of the organizations that they scanned had at least one publicly exposed KEV in 2023, which is a lot.
I wonder whether there's a misnomer around that. It's just quite easy to patch things, and you kind of build these vulnerability management teams and unleash them into saying go and patch everything. But in reality and practically, it's not always as easy to do that, right?
Yeah. And also, like recently, CISA were going on about like D-Link, or whoever, random routers and stuff, which are at end of life. No one can actually do anything about them, but they've got vulnerabilities in them. Lots of them being, I think, just a default password and something else, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Well, I think there was some stuff in the Verizon report, which I think came out in May. It was recent. It's certainly
fits the brief.
Next on the list, don't you worry, get in there.
But no, there was something in that I was actually going through the Verizon report for one of the places I write for, and I was trying to pick out 10 things I thought were interesting. I got to 9, and I had to borrow one from someone else. So there's no diss on Verizon, but maybe producing an 80-page report for people to digest quickly is not always possible. But there was actually content in there about how long it takes to patch a vulnerability and how many remain unpatched after a year, which, those of us with memories long enough to Eternal Blue would go, how the heck was something unpatched for so long? And then there's your answer. Because it can take time to patch, it can knock systems offline, it can make things not work, to be very, very untechnical. And I think that's the problem, is that why we do see these continually unpatched vulnerabilities. Yeah, as an industry, we kind of hype, thou must patch immediately and thou must do it every whatever Wednesday of the month after Patch Tuesday. But in reality, it's a lot harder than that. And I think it's, if there is a step forward, is there a way to worry less about patch immediately, more about how to patch more responsibly and more kind of just more appreciatively for how people work?
Yeah. But a lot of it, I think, is prioritization. I know a lot of infrastructure bods get quite religious on that particular Tuesday each month because there's just that thing of the more important something is, the more likely it is to go wrong when you patch it. And surely that's something we can all work on. And I got the Verizon data up here, which had that it was an average. So I assume they mean mean instead of median, like the last guys did. 55 days to remediate 50% of KEV vulnerabilities. So that's a lot less than BitSight, but does suggest there's a bit of a kind of skew in the data at least. But they also said that out of 30,000 breaches they investigated in 2023, 8% of them were MOVEit incidents. So that's 2,400 MOVEit incidents that they investigated in 2023, which is which is huge. And they said so they gave stats about how much is extortion, how much is whatever else and stuff. And they said, they're skewed, like they show big spikes in extortion and all of this, but they said we can prove that like a lot of that is just move it.
Yeah, and it's back to the kind of topic that we've been banging on about, right? It's such a good return on investment for threat actors, right? To perform these mass exploitation events against edge services and infrastructure devices. We've got our own research, our incident response function in 2024 so far. Fully half of the engagements have been initial access gained through compromising of an internet exposed service. So
yeah,
it's definitely there.
Yeah, and then speaking of that, through Rapid7, their stats, they said over 50%, 53% of mass compromise events rose from 0 days alone in their data in 2023. And I think Mandiant as well last month, they said that they'd seen more 0 day than end day going on. But the interesting thing that moving away from the vulnerabilities in Rapid7's data was they said 47% of incidents were the result of missing or unenforced MFA. Yeah. And this month, thanks to some more kind of details trickling out, we know that Change Healthcare, with their $1.6 billion bill for their ransomware attack, that was a Citrix portal that didn't have MFA on it. So someone had like stolen credentials and there was no MFA, so they could get in and move laterally from there.
And then there's a 1.6 billion hole.
But does the MFA thing, does that fit inside vulnerability management? I'm not criticizing you, I'm just curious. How does that all fall into one thing? Yeah,
I think that's not, well, it's not technically a vulnerability, but there have been some weird things added to vulnerability lists recently. So like there was a stolen or abused code signing certificate that Microsoft made a CVE for, and you're like, well, that's not a technical vulnerability. That's an organization.
You kind of consider a vulnerability there as anything that can be exploited in any which way. So a human is vulnerable. I kind of understand it in terms of it's not a CVE.
I've known people who should have had CVEs.
yeah, you're talking to one.
Didn't want to say Tim.
Yeah. Well, you threw me slightly with a KEV because I do someone called Kev. I was thinking now I've just got a picture of Kev in my head. But it's an interesting one. Yeah, like I totally get Tim what you said. That anything's a vulnerability if it can be exploited. I think that MFA is, I guess, often is it a choice? I suppose I'm trying to think of. Is it a choice to not enable MFA on your Gmail, for example, or your webmail? Is that a vulnerability? You're creating a vulnerability for yourself, arguably, but then here's a sort of here's a concept. If you download the app, is that a vulnerability? The authenticator app,
Well, you have the whole when they try and apportion like legal blame for something. So like SolarWinds, they obviously that was a whole different situation. But if you're trying to apportion legal blame, one of the things is, did you take sufficient care as a caretaker of other people's data? And so not using MFA, I think, has been, there was a solicitor, I believe, in the UK who got fined for not taking sufficient care to protect their customers' data because they didn't have MFA.
I think we'd call it a kind of posture management, security posture management issue. Anyway, use MFA, folks.
Use it.
Yeah.
And
there are more stats. I'm sick of stats right now. So was the Secure by Design pledge, where CISA, the US cyber agency, have announced that 68 leading software manufacturers have signed a voluntary pledge to begin implementing Secure by Design ethos. So building in security from the beginning of the product life cycle, moving it left, whatever you want to call it. And they've explicitly stated that they will, here's a callback, increase the use of MFA, reduce the use of default passwords, reduce the prevalence of certain types of vulnerabilities. I don't know why certain types, unless it's just... let's focus on the
very
big ones.
Orwellian, isn't it? Yeah. So some vulnerabilities are more important than others. Yes.
Attempt to improve patching rates, which are maybe addressing that issue of patching is harder than we think, kind of thing. Publish a vulnerability disclosure policy if they don't have one. Improve their CVE disclosure transparency. Yes, certain companies should probably do that. And increase their customers' ability to gather evidence of cybersecurity intrusions affecting their products. And that last one, I think, is really tied to, was it
Palo Alto?
Palo Alto, that was it. I'm forgetting which company with OS at the end of their OS name it was.
Palo OS, yeah. So for context, there was a mass exploitation event against Palo Alto firewalls. It was a VPN.
It was the VPN in the firewall. So Palo Alto Global Connect,
and
stuff.
the file system was so locked down, it's really difficult to perform kind of adequate forensics on them.
So you had to send an image of your file system to Palo Alto. They'd look at it and give you a rating between 0 to 4 of how compromised you might have been.
Right. Okay.
Which I mean, like there were some very clever people working at Palo Alto. I know there are, and so this must have been the best solution that could be come up with. But it feels like a committee kind of.
I got nothing but sympathy for those poor people working at Palo Alto over the last few weeks. It must have been such a tough job, because you're just bombarded. Even if people, with anybody looking for any kind of level of assurance or CISOs, with tough questions from their board, it must have just been weekends were cancelled, I think, and then some.
Yeah, I mean, the secure by design thing is kind of an interesting one. If you want to just roll back to that, I think, Tim, you were saying before we started recording about, who was building without security in mind, security, design without design. I guess it's a curious one. And as I wrote about this for one of the outlets I cover, SC UK, and what I was interested to see was at which vendors were backing it. I then found a page with a quote from every single vendor involved. It was like, right, which ones do I like the most? And it was it was kind of a bit like sort of kind of a ride of positivity. And it's a bit like, once someone's going to say, this is rubbish, there's no way anyone this is going to do this. I think any kind of pledge to be better is good, but I think at the same time, this just all felt like this should have been done several years ago, and maybe more voluntarily than kind of someone coming out saying, everyone do this now. And also, what jurisdiction does CISA have over? I mean, I'm presuming every company that pledged to it is an American HQ'd or registered,
or is a company. And this is something I've kind of theorized before. Is that it's a pledge. It's not compulsory. It's not a stick you can be beaten with. But the American government spends a lot of money on tech and software and security, and so they can't make them do it, but they can say, if you're not doing this, you are less likely to win bids.
So, something needed to happen. I mean, looking at the state of some of these vulnerabilities that have been exploited in 2024, I mean, there's been a few that have just, I think, was it Screen Connect was described as embarrassingly simple.
Yes.
And it's quite strong wording, right, in terms of the state of the security health. So it's a step in the right direction. I think you're right. You're right, Dan.
Yeah, it is step. I think it is. It's got positive. There'll be ramifications from it that are positive, and I think a lot of companies will step up to this. But I can't remember from the top of my head what the kind of the timeline was. Is it within 12 months thou must have done? But what happens if they don't? Do they get named and shamed?
Yeah, we don't know.
Well, this insert name of company without which would defame anyone. So
do they just silently get deleted off the bottom of the signed list? Is that,
Oh, right. So
I don't know.
People like me go through and go, right, which one missed out? Oh, it's that one. Yeah.
I mean, one thing I did note is that some of these companies have already had posted really strangely large patches, or patched a bunch of CVEs from 2011, or it maybe feels like they're starting work. And it was stuff like Microsoft, Cisco, Fortinet, Palo Alto, GitHub and GitLab, Ivanti are on there. All of this. So yeah. Good.
Okay, well let's move on, but I think the next story is kind of tied to both of those preceding stories, right?
Yeah. So the Norwegian National Cybersecurity Centre have made an official recommendation that organisations should stop using SSL VPNs or web VPNs and replace them with IPsec-based solutions, which distinction.
Before you kind of go into the distinction, can you kind of explain what those concepts are, maybe for our?
Yeah. So this is the thing. Web VPNs or SSL VPNs are generally the things that you get built into your firewalls, and they use the TLS encryption protocol, which is a web-based, for doing HTTPS encrypted websites, secure websites and stuff, and using that to encrypt your VPN tunnels, your virtual tunnels across the internet.
So the same kind of level of encryption that you would get going to google.com.
Yeah, or banks or anything. So, it's very well encrypted and so on. But as they've raised out, the problem is it's not a standard. The whole thing put together is just how people have taken, SSL, TLS, and a few other protocols and things, and glommed them together in their product.
Glom is a new word, I think, for me, is it?
Yeah, definitely for me too.
Technical term.
Just use it more.
Yes. Whereas IPsec, like an IPsec, tunneling, is a whole standard, ratified, RFC'd, etc., that's tied to, the IP standard. So if you're using IPsec, it's still an implementation the company's done, but they're implementing a full standard that encrypts things and regularly checks or resets your keys and stuff like this. So yeah, basically they're saying move from the roll your own version that is SSL VPN and Web VPN to IPsec. And obviously the reason for that is that they've said there's just been so many vulnerabilities and things that have come out in the wash in the last year. And I totted them up and got to something at least 500,000, by some counts, maybe 1 million SSL or Web VPN, devices that have had vulnerabilities and been exposed on the internet in the last year.
Yeah.
And may still be. And that was only on, I think, 2024, 2023 vulnerabilities as well. And as we know, there have been ransomware groups happily exploiting vulnerabilities that are, 4, 5, 10 years old for access. So it doesn't have to be new and shiny to work. I know that's the problem. But reading this, I didn't realize, sorry to monologue, but I didn't realize that the US and UK have already made this recommendation in previous years.
Just not as publicly. Yeah.
I know. Or maybe when they recommended it, everyone went, why?
Yeah.
And now Norway have gotten, and everyone's going, yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah. We're all beaten down by the amount of...
I guess the thing that stands to me is that if it's roll your own versus industry top standard, then that does make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Because, you don't roll your own crypto and think that works better than what, someone else has built for you, or, some cryptographer has built. So yeah, that's what it strikes to me, which probably means it's a positive thing. But then if everyone's using the same thing, there's one exploit. The whole world is vulnerable. What do we do from that? So
this is true.
Yeah,
it's true. But yeah, it's so that's the one that's come out, and it sounds pretty good. But their recommendations, I also found interesting. They said if you can't replace your existing solution or disable the SSL VPN, and if IPsec is not possible for some reason, they're like, use 5G broadband. I was like, I wouldn't have thought of that as the initial recommendation there. But I mean, that not initial recommendation.
I don't know enough about the infrastructure on 5G, I guess.
No, exactly. But I assume it's all quite encrypted and because I know that there's a lot of...
I guess I'd like to think so, yeah.
You'd hope so.
Well, you think of it being relatively new, it should be up to standard, but there will still be people saying it gives you COVID, so what can you do?
I mean, this is
cut that if you want.
We've gone full Joe Rogan now.
Oh dear.
Okay, great. Let's move on to ransomware. Now, I think just in terms of the numbers, then, so one caveat is this is not quite the end of the month yet. So one of the trade-off of doing this kind of live in person with Dan is we haven't quite got to the end of May, so the numbers aren't quite up to speed. But I can give you where they were as of yesterday. So we're looking at and yesterday being the 28th of May. So most of the way through May, there was a massive number of ransomware victims posted to breach sites. And we can go into why. So 489, it's the highest number in 6 months. So think about November last year, was in the early 500s. It might be there today or tomorrow. So it could be the highest number this month in more than 6 months. And really that's because of Lockbit. Steve, you mentioned earlier, maybe you're getting bored of the Lockbit story. I'm not, actually. I'm really enjoying it. Yeah, Lockbit's busiest month in history. They've posted 171 victims, which is more than they've ever posted in a single month before.
171.
171,
wow.
Yeah. And of which, so they were, I think you've kind of been living under a tech rock if you haven't seen, or if you've been on holiday, you haven't seen the Lockbit, the story of where they named Lockbit SUP and they actually attributed to an identity. And that was a great operation. I'll come on to kind of why I really like that in a minute. But so the day after that, or 2 days after that, there started being a really aggressive flurry of victims being posted to the Lockbit site. So I think on the 9th of May, 77 victims were posted by Lockbit.
Someone took something personally.
Yeah, on the 8th of May, Lockbit SUP was exposed. So there was some speculation that it was a reactionary post. And I'm monologuing a little bit, but I'll just kind of go on to a really bit of interesting research that was done by a researcher at Valerie M Archive online, and who was looking at some of the data points around the breach sites. And what he did was he went through the index and the file structures, looking for the latest date of the file that were in the data leaks. And actually, at the time, and this was back in on the 9th of May. A lot of those files were seen relatively old, from relatively old breaches. At least, the repository from which Lockbit had exfiltrated data hadn't been updated since kind of typically February, March, something from 2023, this kind of thing. So really, we don't know the extent behind kind of how many of these breaches are kind of new activity from Lockbit or old breaches that have just been come to light. People have been speculating that people that have paid necessarily are now hitting the breach site. We don't know that, unfortunately. We've got no kind of cases, but it would certainly be really interesting and a kind of an emotional and knee-jerk response from Lockbit Sup. But I guess I'm going to throw it over to you guys now, just because I've been talking for a long time, and get your thoughts on that. But it's certainly a really interesting development.
Yeah, I did see the Lockbit Sup. And whatever you want to call it, naming. I suppose the only thing we can really call it indictment is it. It's a bit like the wanted poster went up, didn't it?
Yeah.
It's interesting that they are still victims are still being caught, I suppose is one of a better word. People are still being caught out by this ransomware. For all that's been done this year so far, is like how much effort has actually been to stop people getting infected. Because if people are still getting infected on a daily basis, then for all of the wanted posters from various law enforcement, then how the heck is this being stopped? Now, then you've got the element of the kind of like the waterbed element. And if they go away, then they'll just pop up with BitLock or something like that. Or some whatever it's some other version. Yeah. And it's an interesting. Obviously, it's terrible. There's been some media reports of cyber incidents, people not paying ransom and stuff like that. But I think it's not great that despite that all the efforts being done, that people are still getting caught, and I just don't really see the progress.
I guess possibly there was the fact that the law enforcement collaboration effort, which was brilliant, took some decryption keys and managed to actually enable an awful lot of organizations to recover.
Yeah,
doesn't necessarily mean
1,000 keys or something. I think they've got.
Yeah, but doesn't necessarily mean they can unsteal the data, which possibly. So this could be related, and I think if you look at Lockbit's average number, I guess it's relatively consistent because there was a drop off.
Yes,
last month and the month before.
There were drops those months, and there's also that thing about have ransomware numbers been affected by the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because now there's an even harder cut off between Russian finance and Western finance, and so while obviously ransomware has been enabled by crypto because then they can get money without being sanctioned on their accounts and stuff like this. There's now also even less worry for them, essentially, that they might overstep a line and get traded by the Russian government, or that they're if they're holding finances in some kind of advantageous Western country. Well, now it's even harder to do that. So I wonder, it does sort of feel like it's a complex situation. So we're talking about people getting hacked, but we're also talking about people doing the hacking. We can only control one of those things.
Yeah.
So,
and they're still doing it. It's still happening.
And it's easier to stop. It's very hard to protect people from that kind of thing because there's so many ways to be infected by ransomware. I don't know how Lockbit spreads. I presume it's by
anything that works, really.
Right. Yeah, anyway.
You can look at the stats, and because it's people doing it, Lockbit supply the software and other people essentially do the hacking, and it's however works for them. So phishing, like Crackbot or Emotet, info stealer infections, mass exploitation of vulnerable devices. We said Blackbuster and voice phishing and so on, which I think we're going to.
Yeah, that's a great segue. Actually, should we move on? Should we move on to that now?
Yes. Blackbuster have been, Microsoft has stated that Blackbuster have been performing voice phishing, so calling people up, doing the classic kind of tech support scam, getting them to enable Microsoft Quick Assist and give them the connection key. It's kind of a built-in remote management tool that Microsoft have put into Windows. And they get access to Quick Assist, they connect in, and then they can start setting themselves up on the network, encrypting things and so And Microsoft have suggested that the way organizations can protect themselves against this is by blocking or uninstalling the Quick Assist, functionality from Windows. Like that's their kind of way to address this. It's not the only thing they've been using. They've been using, insert rogues gallery of abused RMMs here. But the fact that they were doing voice calls to people to then scam them into doing this.
So these are phone calls from genuine people, no more deep scam, deep.
No, it seems like they've got like call centers.
Yeah, so it's really effective because it's living off the land, right?
Yeah.
And it's an actual social engineering. So a user is doing this, so it's almost impossible for a endpoint detection product to detect.
And even if they do, if the users, using their local device and stuff, they can just click. No, it's just fine.
Yeah.
Unless you're locking them out.
And you're right to kind of call attention to AI, and I guess that the bottleneck is the capacity to perform the social engineering attack, right? So anything that kind of increases that capacity is a concern, whether that's cheap outsourcing or whether that's kind of advances in technology and deepfake technology.
Exactly.
It's one to definitely keep an eye on.
I think, this Quick Assist being disabled, it's a bit like everything's got a purpose and can be used nefariously. You could pick up a hammer and bang a nail in or bang it in someone's head. It's just, and a piece of technology is a much difference there, because if it's this is built for a reason. So it's got a purpose, this Quick Assist, but it's at the same time, it's like, well, if it's being used nefariously, is to stop it working, stop using it altogether. Is that the best option? I know it's quite a hard one to determine there, because if it's got good and bad uses, then
it's the issue about abuse of tools, isn't it? I mean, personally, if we're talking about things like Cobalt Strike, which are tools specifically designed for hacking into things where the only differentiation is who's doing it, I feel that's slightly different. But if you're talking about like a remote, a remote help tool that you might use to connect to your parents' PC
And just finally on the ransomware piece, construction, biggest sector impacted, hospitals and healthcare. Second, I think we see more hospitals and healthcare in the news because it's probably a bit more unconscionable. But construction as an industry is kind of constantly way up there.
Not sure why. I mean, what's the kind of the what's the classic? You go where the criminals go where the money is, so they go to the banks or even the retailers. That's where the money is. But what's construction? Is it to stop things being built?
Yeah, well, you got the traditional project management triangle is you can have it quick, you can have it good, you can have it secure, but you can't have all three. Or you can have it quick, good, or cheap.
Sounds like DevSecOps to me,
two.
But yes.
Yeah. Well, that's from before DevSecOps, when I were a lad. But there's a similar thing with security as well, of are they going where the money is? Are they going where it's easy? Or are they going or is it just random chance and there are lots of them? And it's kind of working that out. Are they, so financial institutions might have fewer compromises, we hope, but you would also expect they would make more money from them. Construction, is it that they have a low security threshold and that's where they're going? Is it that, delays in construction, there's a very real world impact? Are they more likely to pay to get back on the road? That's where, people think healthcare gets targeted because there's a real sensitivity there.
Or is it just threat actors target vulnerabilities and something has to be on top?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, if they're scanning for whatever, and that's where they find it.
Could be a mixture of all of them.
And we get this whole this is the highest one, and you kind of go, well, if we had like a good graph of what's going on every month, is it just a blip up? Is it a strong signal? Are we just looking at?
Yeah, I get frustrated when if somebody I had a kind of conversation recently where somebody says, well, X vendor released research to say X sector was being targeted more. And I was like, well, more than what? Was this a report were they trying to generate a sales in that sector? It kind of sounds like you're looking at correlations and not causations. Anyway, right, that's ransomware section done. Tick.
Right, so Sweden were targeted by DDoS attacks or more DDoS attacks upon joining NATO. Kind of expected. The background being that there are a lot of Russian-aligned hacktivist groups. I put as many of those words in quotes as I could. And they launch DDoS attacks and spout a lot of Russian propaganda, statements and so on, which are hilarious if you ever get the chance to read them. So just around the time that it was implied by NATO members that Sweden would be accepted, there was a jump in attacks against Sweden, in DDoS attacks against Sweden. And then a couple of days before they joined NATO, there was, I think, a new record number of attacks. It was in a single day, it was 183% increase on the same day in the previous year. That was 2,200 attacks in a day. And those attacks came from a lot of Russian-aligned activist groups, like I said, No Name 57, Anonymous Sudan, who are definitely not anonymous or Sudanese, they're Russian, and the Russian Cyber Army. And a couple of these, I think, at least No Name 57 was linked to the Russian state actor Sandworm by Mandiant recently, and they've obviously been in
and the cyber army of Russia reborn. It's just a thin veil of GRU operations.
Exactly, but they do this because the hacktivist attacks get reported, and because they get reported, you actually find it's more likely for those crappy Russian propaganda statements to get covered or published alongside these attack details than if they just put them out straight from the Russian government. So I think that's probably the biggest thing. It's not really the disruption or the impact. The effect is to get that messaging out.
The message and the distraction.
Yeah.
Yeah, you think it was tied to the NATO thing, then it was, it's, you may be part of this global network, but now, but you're not, we're still more powerful than you.
But then I also wonder, is it because it was a big news story? Is it like a warning are they giving a warning to NATO or NATO members? Are they simply using the fact that people are talking about NATO and thus if they do an attack related to what people are talking about? I don't know. I'm not a politician or a hacktivist cyber influencer of some kind. But
all we see isn't all there is.
yes,
that's for sure.
Exactly. But on a kind of related note, so Checkpoint have published some research into a group they're called Void Manticore, who are an Iranian group who do destructive wiper attacks. And they kind of appear to be running a couple of personas, so like Cyber Army and No Name, personas of hacktivist groups. One that targets Albania, that they named Homeland Justice, and one targeting Israel that they named Karma. And they've observed that another Iranian group, who are a lot stealthier and more APT-like, hand off their victims to this louder, noisier hacktivist group for destructive attacks, wipers and things. And they regularly see, big, long, stealthy development by the APT, and then at the end it gets handed off to the loud, noisy wiper to do some destructive things that get a bit of headlines. So quite similar again to the Russian, stealthy actors pass data, do whatever, maybe sock puppeting these personas. So it's interesting to see, both of those.
I think, it's interesting that wiper attacks are still kind of a big thing. I was in one of the sessions here at Sphere with your interim CEO talking about wipers and not Petya and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, it still seems like it's not a nice way of doing things by any means, but it's a very effective way of doing things because it's a pain in the bum to have to deal with, really, isn't it? And, in the case of, not Petya 7 years ago, it was obviously that hit the big freight company, but they're still being used, are they, by hacktivists, and it's still kind of just going out there and knock you offline and deal with it your way.
And somewhere maybe 244, I think the amount of, and these aren't kind of sophisticated malware implants. These are sledgehammers in terms of kind of how they operate, and there's been a ton since the war in Ukraine. Loads of just rudimental wipers have been found all over, kind of Eastern Europe, Ukraine especially.
Yeah, and then this Iranian group have been behind what's known as Bibi Wiper, where Bibi, B-I-B-I, I assume it's Bibi, is the nickname of Benjamin Netanyahu, apparently the Israeli prime minister. They've named it after him and then deployed it in Israel. And, it's another kind of way of making a signal for them, and obviously while people can recover with backups generally, if the backups aren't compromised, it does mean you've got to put the effort in, and effort costs money.
Right, onwards. I think my next kind of thing I wanted to speak about was a development in MITRE. Now you were, I don't think I've ever seen you as happy with yourself when you used so there was a compromise at the organisation MITRE. Steve came up with a headline. how the MITRE have fallen,
Oh, very good.
and then
Very good.
and then proceeded to talk about how actually MITRE have done an excellent job.
Yeah.
They're
Up there with the British Library and my favourite organisations.
Yeah. And I just kind of wanted to kind of really briefly say that they've pushed out kind of further details this month. They've been kind of really transparent with what happened. I don't think that I get the sense that they haven't really kept much behind, which is brilliant. And we don't have to go into the details of the actual intrusion, but I just wanted to kind of pay homage to the approach that they've taken. It's been fantastic. So how the MITRE have risen and set a standard, I think, is
exactly. Yeah, and they've published details of what happened. They've published scripts to detect things that they struggled with, so other people can use them to stymie the attackers and so on who got them. And it's really good to see that shown, because that's the thing. They had to think of a solution to the problems they faced in addressing this compromise, and by sharing the solutions they've worked on, so many people can now benefit from that.
I think like you say, they're an organisation. I turn to them whenever I need to get information on a vulnerability, on even just a link to it from an editorial. There's not. The people I've met who work there have been really helpful. So not much negative to say about MITRE at all. And I think it's good to see good response. I did a presentation a few years ago about good and bad responses to incidents, and there's some which the best ones I think are great are just where they literally put out a series of statements, and you can see the times and the dates. And it's like, here's what we know. Nothing, but at least we're saying something, not hiding behind it. So, literally a breakdown of here's our investigation, here's where we worked with, here's what we found, just giving you everything you want. And whether it's customer, whether it's media, it's or industry, it's always just so good to be so transparent rather than sort of going, really? You may say that, I couldn't possibly comment. So, it's positive. And I think, people may remember it, but maybe forgotten about by the end of this month.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to Microsoft. So the kind of security up and down. So you've spoken around some companies pledging to build in security by default, and Microsoft kind of led the way. I think they were the first company to come out and say that. And this month they've made a couple of announcements. One is they're depreciating something called NTLM. This is a authentication protocol. We don't need to go too much into that, but it's weak. And if you can intercept any kind of authentication process, you can extract credentials really, really easily within seconds. So it's outdated, it's deprecated, it's antiquated.
It's the sort of thing that really makes a hacker's day.
Yeah, coming across that. The second thing, deprecating VB script. Again, this is the ability to turn any kind of Word document into a malware, essentially. I was trying to think of an analogy for the layman.
Making it bad.
Yeah, an email bomb, which is kind of looking to be deprecated as well, which is good. However,
yes,
they've also released another feature, or spoke about another feature. Maybe you could talk us through that, Steve or Dan.
Yes, recall. Yes. So a new AI feature, because that's what we all want more of, which boiled down takes a screenshot of what you're doing every couple of seconds and saves it on your computer, and even transcribes any videos or video calls you are on into that record. So you can then go and search it, or take screenshots out of it and so on. And they're going, it's completely safe. Only you logged in as yourself can access this, which does then make me go, have they ever heard of malware?
Dan, can you think of any problems with this?
Yeah, it just does stand out that, all you need to do is share a credential and all of a sudden you've got everything, haven't you? I was listening to something about this and about recall, and the idea is built by someone who actually had quite a sort of memory problem, and then they needed to remember things, or maybe it was some kind of ADHD or something, but it was that from that you think, that's good, but then it's a tricky one to sort of say, here's the benefits, and then, no. Quite frankly, then there's the things that are going to make this bad. So, it's a tricky one. I can see, it certainly got a heck of a lot of attention over the last sort of the period it was being noticed. But it's at the same time, I don't think this will be the only one we'll hear about.
Yeah, as you say, as an option, it is a good idea because regular images throughout the day have shown to help forming memories and recall for people with dementia or brain damage in that area. So as an option, wonderful. As something for everybody, bad.
Yeah, I think introduce it, and then it's something I'd be really interested to see, threat researchers, etc., cybersecurity, have a play with it and see what they find with it. If it's, well, we're going back to the start of the podcast, talking about vulnerabilities and everything, there probably will be. But if it seems to be built pretty safely, well, okay, let's presume on that. But yeah, if it's built to be pretty good, then you can kind of make a judgment on that. But yeah, I think it'd be interesting to see what the rollout of this is going to be.
That's a really good point. We don't actually know how it's going to look in terms of architecture and security. And it, at first, does feel like this is features coming directly into conflict with security. One thing I do know is our offensive security consultants are really interested. I've chatted to a couple. They kind of just see it as another valuable data store that they're going to target.
This is true. But maybe like a fine brie, it smells terrible from a distance.
Yeah.
But it's wonderful up close.
Okay. Well, like I say, it's so it was quite interesting, the juxtaposition of Microsoft making two kind of positive security changes and then saying we're going to record everything ever.
Yeah.
And place it in somewhere that's inherently accessible.
Yes.
To anybody. Fire through couple new AI stories because it's it's the topic du jour, isn't it?
Yeah. So US government proposed a new type of kind of national vulnerability database, like the National Vulnerability Database, but for AI, because AI vulnerabilities are different. It's not necessarily code or technical things like that.
It's good that they're thinking about this ahead of the game.
Yeah, and because a lot of these AI vulnerabilities are sort of attack routes or ways you can convince AIs to do things they're not meant to. And due to the kind of lack of concrete understanding of what they're doing as they're working, it's quite hard to specify apart from, well, if you tell it to pretend that it is in fact something else, it will do what you want.
And LLM jacking.
LLM jacking, yeah. So essentially a hacker group or actor was seen stealing credentials for a cloud provider from their victim, and then using that to run a local LLM, so like Claude 3 or whatever it is. And what they appeared to be doing in a few places was set up some of these local LLMs in the cloud on other people's money, and then they were being accessed via what appeared to be a proxy service. So they think they were selling this to other criminals to basically have their own private instance that someone else was paying for. And the estimate is that this could cost, running these private instances could cost up to $56,000 a day to the poor bugger who's paying that.
But there was an economy. There was an underground economy set up around the
hijacking. Really, yeah. So it's we've termed LLM jacking after crypto jacking for that, hijacking someone's cloud to mine cryptocurrency.
But again, it lowers the barrier to people in these criminal forums willing to pay a few quid to get access to an LLM to develop prompts and conduct the social engineering approaches.
Yep. So. Yes. And there was just one more that was that IBM's pen test team, it's kind of, they published a bit of an advert, but it was interesting to me. I've kind of come to the conclusion that a lot of AI features aren't new super cyber weapons or something, but they're efficiency gains. And what they've said is they have a new AI tool they were using for essentially parsing large amounts of data, because when you're doing pen testing, so pretend hacking, the first thing you've got to do really is work out all the ways you might get into the network, find the vulnerabilities or where they may be vulnerable and go in there. And so they found that they could use an LLM to just parse through all this data about the victim, all this scanning data. And they said it took about 8 hours to do what would have been 3 weeks worth of work normally, because it's parsing lots of data. So that's fun.
Cool. Okay, so I think that's kind of the main stories for talking about, but there's still kind of plenty more. May's been a busy month as ever. And Steve's been doing his vocal exercises, getting ready for his news and brief section. So just for your awareness, Dan, in post-production, there's some really tense music that goes on top of Steve trying to rattle through 8 to 10 stories in a strict 2-minute window. We count how many times he comes up for air as well, which is not many. So just the news and brief, Steve. Take it away.
Going in. First things first, Change Healthcare have announced that they were compromised via an MFA-less Citrix account. They didn't have MFA on an external access, and so when someone stole a credential, they were to get straight in. Reminder, that cost them $1.6 billion for not doing that. Microsoft have announced organizational change. We didn't think they would get around that quickly. In fact, I talked a lot about how not quickly it would be, and here we go. They said they're going to make lots of organizational changes, tie the pay awards of their executives to prioritizing security over new features, and do a bunch of other things. MITRE, in their announcements of what's been going on, have said that the hack actually began in December 2023, so they must have been one of the first organizations hacked through Ivanti Connect Secure. So that's interesting to me. Dropbox Sign, which is a DocuSign-like service that Dropbox offered, has been compromised. It appears once again that there was a server's account that didn't have MFA on, and it was compromised through there. Lots of stuff about their customers was stolen. A piece of router malware called Cuttlefish has been described by Lumen Technologies, and apparently this compromises Soho routers and will actually look for authentication comms going through the router to particular destinations and steal it for the threat actor, which I think is interesting, even though it was only apparently deployed on on an ISP in Turkey. Citrix NetScaler have disclosed a flaw with similarities to Citrix Bleed. Lots of people got very tense at that. It's a lot smaller, it's more miniature, it's more like a paper cut, apart from not the paper cut vulnerability. Let's not say paper cut, it's fine. An even larger US healthcare provider named Ascension have taken systems offline. They run 140 hospitals and 40 care homes in 19 states. And they have a turnover of $28 billion, so about 6 times that of Change Healthcare. Hopefully that's fine. Apparently, the Mirai botnet, which I haven't had to talk about in a very long time, has been exploiting Ivanti Connect secure devices. So there's a whole mix of old and new going on. Just shows that everybody's getting in on that particular one. Some ICS modems, so industrial control system modems, which you would use to control remote things in remote places, are vulnerable to remote code execution via SMS. You just send them the right text message and it will execute code for you. That's pretty bad. We also have Apple device geolocation. The API is leaking up-to-date whereabouts of hundreds of millions of devices. You send them a query about where am I, here's some info. Apple send you 400 possibly nearby Wi-Fi access points. Send enough queries rapidly and you can map out quite a lot of things like the Russia-Ukraine war or, the movement of migrants across the world and things like this. So it's interesting, but bad. And I think we're done.
Okay, I think that's it. Thanks very much. See you all next month.
This podcast was brought to you by Flow, your local partner for global solutions. For more info, visit flowtransform.com.